The day two legends said no. January 20th, 1961. Washington, D.C. was preparing for the most star-studded presidential inauguration in American history. Frank Sinatra was orchestrating a gala that would feature every major name in Hollywood. The guest list read like a who's who of American entertainment. But in the weeks leading up to that frozen January morning, 2 phone calls were made that would send shockwaves through both Hollywood and Washington. John Wayne, the Duke himself, the embodiment of American masculinity and conservative values, called to decline his invitation. Then Dean Martin, the king of cool, Frank Sinatra's closest friend and partner in the Rat Pack, did the same. They weren't sick. They weren't filming. They simply refused to attend. The reason? Their friend, their brother, Sammy Davis Jr., had been uninvited. And if Sammy wasn't welcome at John F. Kennedy's inauguration, then neither were they. This wasn't just a social snub. This was a line drawn in the sand at a time when such lines could end careers, destroy friendships, and reshape the political landscape. This was 1961, when America was still deeply segregated, when interracial marriage was illegal in over half the states, when a black man marrying a white woman could get him killed in many parts of the country. And 2 of Hollywood's biggest stars, men with everything to lose, chose loyalty over politics, friendship over power, and principle over prestige. This is the untold story of the stand that shocked America. This is about what happens when men of honor face an impossible choice between their careers and their conscience. This is about the day John Wayne and Dean Martin proved that true friendship doesn't bend to political winds, no matter how powerful those winds might be. The world they lived in. To understand the magnitude of what Wayne and Martin did, you have to understand America of 1961. This wasn't the America we live in today. This was an America where whites-only signs hung in restaurant windows. This was an America where black entertainers could perform for white audiences, but had to enter through the back door and couldn't eat in the same dining room. This was an America where a black man could be the greatest entertainer in the world and still be treated as a second-class citizen. Hollywood in 1961 was a microcosm of this divided America, but with a twist. On screen, the studios maintained rigid racial boundaries. Black actors were relegated to servant roles, comic relief, or stereotypical characters. But behind the scenes, in the nightclubs of Las Vegas and the recording studios of Los Angeles, something different was happening. A revolution was quietly brewing, led by an unlikely group of rebels, the Rat Pack. Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, Sammy Davis Jr., Peter Lawford, and Joey Bishop weren't just entertainers. They were a statement. Every time they walked on stage together in Vegas, every time they appeared in public as equals, every time they refused to perform in segregated venues, they were chipping away at the walls of racial division. Frank Sinatra had a clause in his contracts that stated he wouldn't perform anywhere that wouldn't let Sammy Davis Jr. stay, eat, or gamble. Dean Martin backed him up completely. But this wasn't easy solidarity. It cost them. Hotels in Las Vegas would book the Rat Pack and then quietly ask Sammy to leave after the show. When the group refused, when they insisted Sammy stay in the same hotel, eat in the same restaurants, and gamble at the same tables, the hotels reluctantly complied, not out of conviction, but because the Rat Pack was too profitable to lose. Money talked, and Sinatra made sure it said the right things. John Wayne occupied a different space in this Hollywood landscape. He was a conservative icon, the man who represented traditional American values, the cowboy who stood for law and order. Politically, Wayne was about as far from the liberal Rat Pack as you could get. He supported conservative causes, backed Republican candidates, and believed in a more traditional vision of America. But Wayne had something that transcended politics, a code of honor. And that code said you stand by your friends, period. When John F. Kennedy ran for president in 1960, Hollywood was electric with possibility. Here was a young, charismatic candidate who represented a new generation. Frank Sinatra threw himself into Kennedy's campaign with everything he had. He organized fundraisers, recorded campaign songs, and used his influence to bring Hollywood's elite into Kennedy's orbit. Sammy Davis Jr. was right there beside him, performing at rallies, raising money, and using his star power to support the man who many believed would finally bring meaningful change to America. But politics in 1960 was a brutal game, and Kennedy's advisors knew that every vote mattered. They knew that Kennedy was already fighting against prejudice himself as a Catholic running for president. They knew that the South was skeptical, that conservative voters were nervous, and that one wrong move could cost them the election. So they watched everyone in Kennedy's orbit very carefully, looking for potential problems, potential scandals, potential liabilities. Sammy's impossible position. Sammy Davis Jr. was living in two worlds, and neither one was easy. In the entertainment world, he was a genius, a triple threat who could sing, dance, and act circles around almost anyone. He could do impressions that left audiences breathless. He could tap dance like he was born with metal on his feet. His voice could belt out show tunes or croon ballads with equal mastery. He was, without exaggeration, one of the most talented performers of the 20th century. But outside the spotlight, Sammy was a black man in America, and that meant living with 1,000 small humiliations and a few very large ones. It meant being the star of the show at night and being denied a room in the hotel after the curtain fell. It meant hearing the applause and then hearing the whispers. It meant knowing that no matter how successful you became, there were places you couldn't go, people who wouldn't serve you, and doors that would forever remain closed. In 1960, Sammy did something that was both brave and, in the eyes of many Americans, unforgivable. He fell in love with a Swedish actress named May Britt, a beautiful blonde woman who was as smitten with him as he was with her. They wanted to get married. In most of America, this was not just controversial, it was illegal. Interracial marriage was banned in 22 states. Even in states where it was legal, it was social suicide. The reaction was swift and vicious. Sammy received death threats. Letters arrived at his home filled with hate, with threats to kill him, to kill May, to make them pay for daring to cross the color line. Clubs in the South canceled his bookings. Radio stations stopped playing his records. The Ku Klux Klan made it clear that if Sammy Davis Jr. married a white woman, there would be consequences. But Sammy loved May, and May loved Sammy, and they decided that love was worth the risk. They planned their wedding for November 1960, right before the presidential election. It was terrible timing, and Kennedy's people knew it. The phone calls started coming to Frank Sinatra, polite at first, then more urgent, then almost desperate. Kennedy's advisors, the cold, calculating men who saw everything through the lens of vote counts and polling numbers, explained the problem. Sammy Davis Jr. marrying a white woman right before the election was going to cost them votes. It was going to cost them the South. It was going to hand ammunition to Nixon's campaign. It was going to be a disaster. The solution they proposed was simple and heartless. Sammy needed to postpone the wedding until after the election. Or better yet, he needed to distance himself from the Kennedy campaign entirely. He needed to disappear for a while, lie low, let the heat die down. And Sammy, loyal Sammy, who had worked so hard for Kennedy, who believed in what Kennedy represented, was being told that his love, his personal happiness, his basic human right to marry the woman he loved, was a political liability that needed to be managed. Frank Sinatra delivered the message. It was one of the hardest things he ever had to do. He sat with Sammy and explained the situation. The campaign was worried. They thought it would hurt Kennedy's chances. They needed Sammy to wait. And Sammy, heartbroken but ever the loyal soldier, agreed. He postponed his wedding. He stepped back from the campaign. He did what was asked of him because he believed in the cause. Kennedy won the election in November 1960 by one of the narrowest margins in American history. The wedding was rescheduled for shortly after, and when Sammy and May finally married, they did so under a cloud of controversy that never fully lifted. Sammy had sacrificed for Kennedy. He had put his personal life on hold. He had been the good soldier. And now, with Kennedy preparing for his inauguration, Sammy expected to be there, to celebrate the victory he had helped achieve, to stand with his friend Frank and the rest of the Rat Pack and bask in the glow of this new Camelot. That's when the second blow came. Kennedy's people called again. This time, the message was even more brutal. Sammy couldn't come to the inauguration. His presence would be too controversial. There would be Southern congressmen there, conservative donors, people who were already nervous about Kennedy's liberal tendencies. Seeing Sammy Davis Jr. and his white wife at the inauguration would send the wrong message. It would create problems Kennedy couldn't afford, not when he was just starting his presidency. So Sammy Davis Jr., who had campaigned for Kennedy, who had sacrificed his wedding for Kennedy, who had believed that Kennedy represented a new era of equality and justice, was being uninvited from the inauguration, not quietly, not privately, but in a way that everyone would notice. His absence would be conspicuous. It would be a statement. And that statement was, even in this new progressive administration, Sammy Davis Jr. was still not fully welcome. The brotherhood that wouldn't break. The Rat Pack wasn't just a group of guys who performed together. It was a brotherhood forged in the unique fires of fame, booze, and late-night Vegas. But more than that, it was built on something real, a genuine affection and loyalty that transcended the usual Hollywood phoniness. Frank Sinatra was the leader, the godfather, the man who made the decisions and set the tone. But Dean Martin was the heart. Dean was a guy who kept things light, who never let the mood get too heavy, who could diffuse any tension with a joke or a well-timed drink. And John Wayne, though not officially part of the Rat Pack, was part of this broader circle of men who understood something fundamental. You stand by your friends. For Sammy, the Rat Pack was more than professional association. It was validation. It was acceptance. When he stood on stage with Frank and Dean, he wasn't a black entertainer performing for white audiences. He was just one of the guys, equal in talent, equal in status, equal in brotherhood. Frank and Dean had fought battles for Sammy that most people never knew about. They had threatened to walk out of venues that wouldn't let Sammy stay. They had forced casinos to integrate their policies. They had used their power as leverage to create small pockets of equality in an unequal world. Dean Martin, in particular, had a special bond with Sammy. Dean was famously apolitical. He didn't march. He didn't make speeches. He didn't wear his beliefs on his sleeve. But when it came to Sammy, Dean's actions spoke volumes. There was a story that circulated in Hollywood about Dean and Sammy arriving at a restaurant that refused to seat Sammy. Dean didn't argue. He didn't make a scene. He just said, "Then I guess neither of us is eating here." Turned around and walked out with Sammy. That was Dean's way. Quiet loyalty, no fanfare, just action. John Wayne and Sammy Davis Jr. had an even more surprising friendship. On the surface, they were political opposites. Wayne was conservative, traditional, a supporter of the Vietnam War and law and order. Sammy was liberal, progressive, a civil rights activist. But they connected on something deeper, a mutual respect, a shared understanding of what it meant to be a professional, and genuine affection that transcended politics. Wayne had watched Sammy perform and been awed by his talent. He had seen the discrimination Sammy faced and, in his own way, been troubled by it. Wayne's conservatism wasn't rooted in racism. It was rooted in a belief in individual merit and personal honor. And he saw in Sammy Davis Jr. a man of immense merit being denied his due because of the color of his skin. It offended Wayne's sense of fairness. It violated his code. So when word spread through Hollywood that Sammy had been uninvited from Kennedy's inauguration, the reactions were swift. Frank Sinatra was furious. He had worked tirelessly for Kennedy. He had organized an inaugural gala. He had put his reputation on the line. And now his friend, his brother, was being tossed aside for political convenience. Frank felt betrayed, and his anger was volcanic. But it was the reactions of Dean Martin and John Wayne that truly shocked people, because these were men who had nothing to gain and everything to lose by making a stand. The Duke's decision. John Wayne had been invited to Kennedy's inauguration despite their political differences. Kennedy's team wanted to show that the new president could unite Americans across party lines. Having the Duke, the most recognizable Republican in Hollywood, at the inauguration would send a powerful message of national unity. For Wayne, the invitation was an honor, a recognition of his status as an American icon. But when Wayne learned what happened to Sammy, he faced a choice that cut to the core of who he was. On one side was political pragmatism, the smart move, the easy move. He could go to the inauguration, shake Kennedy's hand, be part of history, and let the Sammy situation be someone else's problem. No one would blame him. He wasn't part of the Rat Pack. He wasn't a civil rights activist. He could claim it wasn't his fight. On the other side was his code. Wayne had played cowboys and soldiers and heroes for decades, but he wasn't just acting. He genuinely believed in the values those characters represented: loyalty, honor, standing up for what's right even when it's hard. He believed that a man's word mattered, that friendship wasn't negotiable, and that you judge people by their character, not the color of their skin. Wayne thought about Sammy, this little powerhouse of talent who had overcome poverty and racism to become one of the greatest entertainers in the world. He thought about the times he had watched Sammy perform and been moved by his artistry. He thought about the conversations they had shared, the laughs, the mutual respect. And he thought about what it would mean to go to an inauguration that had explicitly excluded his friend. The decision wasn't easy. Wayne knew what it would cost him. He was already seen as a right-wing figure in Hollywood. Refusing to attend a Democratic president's inauguration would only reinforce that image. But worse, it might be seen as petty, as partisan, as Wayne putting politics above country. He knew how the press might spin it. He knew the criticism that would come. But Wayne also knew something else. If he went to that inauguration after what they did to Sammy, he would never be able to look at himself in the mirror the same way again. He would be betraying everything he claimed to stand for. He would be playing the coward, and John Wayne was many things, but he was not a coward. So he made the call. He told Kennedy's people, politely but firmly, that he wouldn't be attending. When they asked why, when they tried to convince him, when they explained how important his presence would be, Wayne was blunt. Sammy Davis Jr. was uninvited because of who he married. That's wrong. If he's not welcome, then neither am I. The silence on the other end of the phone was deafening. Kennedy's team hadn't expected this. John Wayne was supposed to be the safe bet, the conservative who understood political realities. But Wayne had just made it clear that there were some things more important than politics. There were some principles that couldn't be compromised, and friendship was one of them. Dean's quiet stand. If John Wayne's refusal was surprising, Dean Martin's was devastating to Frank Sinatra's carefully orchestrated inauguration plans. Dean was Frank's best friend, his partner, the guy who could always be counted on. More than that, Dean was the bridge between Frank's intensity and the rest of the world. He was the charm, the ease, the cool that made the Rat Pack work. Dean Martin didn't do political stands. That wasn't his style. He famously said, "I'd rather go to a good racetrack than vote." He didn't march. He didn't protest. He didn't lecture. Dean's philosophy was simple. Do your work, treat people decently, and don't take life too seriously. He was the least political member of the Rat Pack, the guy who just wanted to sing, tell jokes, and play golf. But there was one thing Dean took very seriously: loyalty. You could mess with Dean's career. You could criticize his singing. You could say whatever you want about him. But you didn't mess with his friends. And Sammy Davis Jr. was his friend. When Dean learned that Sammy had been uninvited, he didn't make a big announcement. He didn't call a press conference. He didn't rage or threaten. He just quietly called Frank and said, "I'm not going." Frank, who was already dealing with his own fury and heartbreak over the situation, tried to convince Dean otherwise. The gala needed him. Kennedy needed him. This was history. This was important. But Dean was immovable. In his quiet, unassuming way, he explained it simply. If Sammy can't be there, then it's not our crowd. I'm not going without him. There was no anger in Dean's voice, no self-righteousness. Just a simple statement of fact. This was wrong, and Dean wasn't going to be part of it. For Frank, this was a nightmare. He had spent months organizing this inaugural gala. He had called in every favor, pulled every string, and assembled a lineup that would make history. And now two of his biggest stars, including his best friend, were pulling out over a principle that Frank himself agreed with but felt powerless to change. Frank was caught between his loyalty to Sammy, his commitment to Kennedy, and his desire to make this inauguration perfect. Frank tried everything to fix the situation. He called Kennedy's advisors and pleaded Sammy's case. He argued that excluding Sammy sent the wrong message, that it betrayed the very values Kennedy claimed to represent. But Kennedy's people were unmoved. They had their polling data, their strategic considerations, their political calculations. They weren't going to risk the president's approval ratings for one entertainer, no matter how talented. Frank even called Sammy directly and offered to withdraw from the inauguration himself, to stand with him in solidarity. But Sammy, heartbroken as he was, refused. He told Frank to go, to be part of history, to not let this mess up his relationship with the president. Sammy had spent his whole life making sacrifices, smoothing things over, being the bigger person. He wasn't going to let this be Frank's problem too. But Dean and Wayne had already made their decision, and nothing Frank said could change their minds. They weren't angry at Frank. They understood his impossible position, but they had drawn their line, and they weren't going to cross it. The fallout, the news that John Wayne and Dean Martin had refused to attend Kennedy's inauguration spread through Hollywood like wildfire. For some, it was a scandal. These were two of the biggest stars in America, and they were snubbing the President of the United States. The press wanted to know why. Kennedy's team tried to downplay it, suggested scheduling conflicts, hinted at other commitments. But in Hollywood, everyone knew the truth. The reaction split along predictable lines. Liberals in Hollywood criticized Wayne and Martin for being petty, for putting personal loyalty above national unity, for making a private matter into a public spectacle. Some argued that they were actually hurting Sammy by drawing attention to his absence. If they had just quietly attended, maybe no one would have noticed Sammy wasn't there. But others saw it differently. They saw two men of principle taking a stand when it would have been easier to look the other way. They saw the power of friendship transcending politics. They saw what real loyalty looked like. And in the black community, the response was overwhelming. John Wayne and Dean Martin, neither of whom were known as civil rights activists, had done something that spoke louder than any march or speech. They had sacrificed their own prestige to stand with a black man who had been wronged. For Sammy, the gesture was bittersweet. He was deeply moved by what Wayne and Dean had done. It validated him in a way that applause never could. These men, these icons, had put their friendship with him above everything else. But he also felt guilty. He didn't want to be the cause of division. He didn't want his friends paying a price for his problems. The inauguration went forward without Wayne, without Martin, and without Sammy. Frank Sinatra was there, performing his duties but visibly subdued. The gala was a success by most measures. The performances were spectacular. The celebrities were radiant. Kennedy gave speeches about a new frontier and a changing America. But for those who knew, there was a shadow over the whole thing. The specter of the friends who weren't there, and the reason why they weren't there. In the days and weeks that followed, the relationship shifted in subtle but significant ways. Frank Sinatra's friendship with Kennedy never fully recovered. The closeness they had shared during the campaign was gone, replaced by a cordial but distant relationship. Frank had seen how easily Kennedy's people could discard someone like Sammy for political convenience, and it made him wonder about his own value to them. Dean Martin's respect in Hollywood already high, went even higher. People who had dismissed him as just a singer and comedian began to see the steel underneath the charm. Dean had made a choice that could have hurt his career, and he had made it without hesitation. That kind of integrity was rare in Hollywood, and people noticed. John Wayne became a more complicated figure. He was still a conservative icon, but now he was also the man who had stood up for Sammy Davis Jr. It didn't erase his political views, but added a dimension to his character that made him harder to dismiss. He wasn't just a right-wing cowboy. He was a man with a code who lived by it even when it was inconvenient. The legacy that endures. The story of Wayne and Martin's refusal to attend Kennedy's inauguration is more than just Hollywood gossip. It's a lesson about the choices we make when our principles collide with our interests. It's about the price of loyalty and the value of friendship. It's about what happens when ordinary people, even famous ones, decide that some things are more important than career advancement or political advantage. In the years that followed, the civil rights movement would explode into national consciousness. The Freedom Rides, the March on Washington, the Civil Rights Act, all of these watershed moments would change America in ways that Kennedy's advisors in 1961 could never have imagined. The political calculations that seemed so important in 1961, the need to appease Southern voters, the fear of controversy, would look increasingly outdated and morally bankrupt as the decade progressed. Sammy Davis Jr. would go on to have a remarkable career, But he never forgot what Wayne and Dean had done for him. He spoke about it in interviews, wrote about it in his autobiography, and made sure people knew that true friendship had found him in unexpected places. His relationship with both men deepened over the years. With Dean, it remained the easy, joking friendship it had always been, but with an added layer of respect and gratitude. With Wayne, it became something even more special, a friendship that proved political differences didn't have to mean personal division. Dean Martin continued to be Dean Martin, cool, talented, and fiercely loyal to his friends until the end. He never sought credit for his stand. It wasn't his style. When people asked him about it, he would shrug and say something like, "Sammy's my friend. You don't leave your friend behind." That was Dean's entire philosophy in one sentence. John Wayne carried the story with him differently. For a man who made his living playing heroes, standing up for Sammy Davis Jr. was one of the most heroic things he ever did, precisely because it was real. It wasn't scripted. There was no director to yell cut if it went wrong. It was just a man making a choice and living with the consequences. The irony is that all three men, Kennedy, Wayne, Martin, are gone now. Kennedy's presidency, cut short by assassination, is remembered more for what it promised than what it achieved. But the stand that Wayne and Martin took lives on, it's a reminder that in a world of political calculation and strategic positioning, simple human decency can be the most radical act of all. When Sammy Davis Jr. died in 1990, both Dean Martin and John Wayne were gone, Wayne since 1979, and Dean would follow just 5 years after Sammy. But the story of that refused invitation endures. It endures because it shows us something we need to see, that friendship can cross political lines, that loyalty matters, and that sometimes the right thing to do is also the hardest thing to do. In our current era of division, when political affiliation seems to determine everything from where we shop to who we befriend, the story of Wayne, Martin, and Sammy offers a different model. It shows us that we can disagree on policy while agreeing on principle. It shows us that our shared humanity is more important than our partisan differences. It shows us that standing with a friend who's being wronged isn't a liberal or conservative value. It's a human value. The day John Wayne and Dean Martin refused to attend Kennedy's inauguration, they weren't trying to make history. They weren't trying to send a message to America. They were just being friends. They were just doing what they thought was right. But in doing so, they showed us what courage looks like when it's not on a movie screen. They showed us what loyalty looks like when there's actually something at stake. And they showed us that sometimes the most powerful political statement is refusing to participate in something that violates your principles. That's the real legacy of that snowy day in January 1961. Not the speeches that were given or the performances that were staged, but the two men who stayed home because their friend wasn't welcome. In a world that constantly pressures us to compromise our value for advancement, to stay silent about injustice to keep the peace, to put ambition above principle, Wayne and Martin did the opposite. They paid the price, they faced the criticism, and they never regretted it. Rest in peace to all three men. Sammy, the talent who overcame every obstacle. Dean, the cool heart who never forgot his friends. And Duke, the cowboy who rode for what was right, even when no one was watching. Their stand that day in 1961 still echoes through the years, reminding us that true friendship doesn't bend to political winds, and that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is simply stay home with your principles intact.